But fuel was being added daily to the fire of challenge facing Brigham Young. The Union Pacific Railroad was slow in paying for the Mormon work being done in Weber and Echo Canyons. Brigham Young's personal guarantee to his people of getting paid well and in cash was in jeopardy of falling apart. Missing paydays with regularity, workers were sometimes paid in food from church storage. Workers started to walk off the job.
October 11th, 1868. Dear Brother Musser, people are leaving their work on the railroad and are complaining of not getting their payment in cash. This is not agreeable to the progress of the work on President Young's contract. C.A. Madsen.
Young was soon receiving a steady flow of complaining letters in his office.
October 8th, 1868. There is much dissatisfaction among the men. The monthly payments have only been 1/3 or 1/2 of the value of the work. Very many of the men are unpaid, and numbers are compelled to leave the work to provide for their families.
By the time we get to 1868 and 1869, as the railroad is about to enter into Utah territory, the Union Pacific is basically completely cash-strapped. Banks were ready to foreclose. Loans were taken out to pay other loans. I mean, the whole thing could have collapsed under the right circumstances.
By the end of November 1868, Brigham Young, as primary contractor, owed his fellow Mormons well over $100,000 for work already completed. He had tapped personal and church cash accounts, believing repayment from the Union Pacific was imminent. When it did not arrive, Young sent a personal plea to Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific.
I have expended all my available funds in forwarding the work. If I had the means to continue, I would not now ask for assistance. Very truly yours, Brigham Young.
Knowing that Mormon labor would be critical for a final push out of the canyons, Durant convinced Young to keep workers on the job, building a railroad bed through the town of Ogden to the north of the Great Salt Lake, in the direction of the Nevada border. Young told associates that Durant had promised to pay any cost. At the same time, Leland Stanford appeared in Salt Lake City, representing the Central Pacific Railroad. Stanford wanted the same number of Mormons to aid his railroad's drive from Nevada to the Wasatch Front. Again, Young would confide that Stanford had agreed to pay any price.
And there's a moment where Brigham Young accepts a contract, of course, and subcontracts it out from the Union Pacific to grade up past Ogden toward the Promontory Mountains. And then the Central Pacific people come in and they say, well, can you give us a contract too? And all of a sudden Young is presented with the delightful idea of playing one off against the other and collecting money from both sides.
November 8th, 1868. This is our policy. We can't keep the Union Pacific from grading their line, but through Young, we can have our own graded to lay track on when we can reach it. Leland Stanford.
Already deep in debt, Young decided to wager the economic future of thousands on the cutthroat competition between the Central and Union Pacific. Young believed the demand for labor was certain to ensure that he and the men would be paid. And at first, it seemed to pay off. Soon Mormon crews were simultaneously working for the Central and Union Pacific, grading rail lines east and west in northern Utah. Mormon subcontractors soon got into a bidding war for local workers, as manpower was in short supply in the face of the head-to-head battle.
Competition for men and teams became so great that the companies began to bid off each other's men by increasing wages, and the construction costs became enormously heavy. Joseph A. West.
Brigham's contractors ratcheted up wages, confident that their costs would be met by the railroads. And Brigham Young urged the work forward, confident in his agreements with both companies that any price would be paid to keep the workers on the job.
Dear brethren, it is my wish and counsel to all the brethren working on my contract to push the work ahead with all possible dispatch. Therefore, brethren, work at it until the job is completed. Brigham Young.
Completion seemed to be at hand. But if the nation had expected the two railroad companies to gently stop when they reached each other, most observers were stunned when the two companies kept right on going. Soon the railroads were passing each other's work crews, crossing each other's survey stakes, building competing bridges to cross the same gully.
The whole idea seems to be in their minds that whoever got the final okay for the trackage would get the money. And so therefore it didn't matter if they graded extraneously, if their survey stakes were within inches of one another, even if they laid their railroad track over the top of the tracks of the other company.
At one point, they are probably within 200 feet of us. From Bear River to the promontory, we are so close that the UP cross us twice. In other areas, their line occasionally runs within a few feet of us. Leland Stanford.
The nation that had struggled to get the railroad started now realized it had not created a mechanism to make the railroad companies stop.
When they realized that if they didn't come up with a meeting point themselves, the government was going to pass some really quick and dirty legislation and make the decision for them. And they finally decided that they would meet in the Promontory Mountains at Promontory Summit.
But even with the final meeting place set at Promontory Summit, there was one final act of competitive pride in Utah that the Central Pacific Railroad considered unfinished business. The Union Pacific had set what it claimed was a world record for laying track when it spiked 8 miles of rail into place on one day. Union Pacific executives claimed the record demonstrated their superior planning and skill. They dangled a $10,000 bet before the Central Pacific, claiming the record could not be beaten. On April 28, 1869, Charlie Crocker of the Central Pacific dramatically called their bluff.
Indeed. In fact, it's interesting that Central Pacific waited to set this record when Union Pacific was bogged down on the east slope of the Promontory Mountains and would never have a chance to answer back. And it took an army of men, hundreds and hundreds of men were part of that track laying to lay out the ties and ballast the track and everything and pound the spikes. But it was actually a crew of about a half a dozen Irishmen that physically laid that 10 miles of iron that one day.
3,500 rails were laid in place. 28,000 spikes were driven by hand. The Irish track layers lifted the equivalent of 125 tons of steel during the 12-hour day. Charlie Crocker and the Central Pacific had their record.
We got our forces together and laid 10 miles, 185 feet in one day. That did not leave them enough room to beat us. But they could not have done it anyhow.
By the first week of May 1869, the rail lines of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific were face to face on the windswept rolling hills of Promontory Summit in Utah. May 8th was set as the date to link the two lines. And then disaster struck.
May 8th does not happen because they were building bridges down through Weber Canyon so quickly that they didn't really pay attention to the fact that this was springtime.
The bridges in Weber Canyon are on the rampage. The past few days' sun has sent the liquidizing snows in torrents, gathering force and assailing the most stupendous railroad crossings. The bridge at Devil's Gate commenced giving way last night. The Deseret News, May 5th, 1869.
Not only were they having trouble with the bridge down in Lower Weber Canyon, but then the vice president of the Union Pacific, Thomas Durant, the grand puppeteer behind everything, is kidnapped by his own men because they are 2 months without any pay. And so in the town of Piedmont, Wyoming, his train was all of a sudden put onto a siding, and masked men got onto the train and hustled him off.
Eventually, the ransom of $80,000, which was just a down payment on what was owed, came, and Durant wasn't turned loose until Saturday, May 8th.
The short-lived kidnapping gave crews enough time to jerry-rig passage at the washed-out bridge of Devil's Gate in Utah. The promontory ceremony was reset for Monday, May 10th. one of the most anticipated events in the nation, had received virtually no pre-planning at Promontory.
In fact, there was almost no planning at all. This was a media event staged for the rest of the country, and the people at Promontory got short shrift.